welcome everybody as you get settled for AEN's first event for membership hosted by our new section for faculty in STEM fields. We're really excited to have launched our interest groups and sections and to have Gary Grossman as chair of this section specifically for faculty of AEN who are self-defined in the STEM fields broadly defined. Today's webinar is going to cover the Israeli response to COVID. We have with us Israeli neuroscientist Avi Avital, who's been at the forefront of considering these kinds of issues and the Israeli response and bringing to bear his insights from his field of study and his discipline to these issues. Before we get started, I just want to introduce Gary Grossman and let you all know a little bit about Gary. In the meantime, as you come in, if you can mute yourselves so we don't have background noise. There will be an opportunity to raise comments in the chat, and I'll get to that in a minute. And of course, you can always also unmute yourself to raise questions and comments. So just by way of some housekeeping at the start, but let me introduce Gary, who's a very distinguished member and longtime member of AEN. And we're delighted to have Gary hosting this event for us. He is a professor of animal ecology at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia in Athens, where he has been a faculty member since 1981. He's published over 140 papers in scientific journals, and his work has been cited over 8,000 times. He's an elective fellow of both the American Fisheries Society and the Linnean Society of London. And Professor Grossman's involvement in Jewish studies involves both the Jewish National Fund, the Schusterman Fellowships. He's also, as I noted, been a longtime member of AEN for a number of years. He's the chair of AEN's recently formed section for faculty in STEM. And this is an interesting factoid that I didn't know, but that Gary shared. He was the force behind the name change of the Jewfish to Goliath grouper by the American Fisheries Society. Professor Grossman's research involves community and population ecology, animal behavior, STEM pedagogy, and he's conducted research throughout the United States, Spain, France, Japan, New Zealand. And he has a website that you can have a look at to see all his work in greater detail. I really recommend it, www.garygrossman.net. And if you follow him on Facebook, as I do, then you will know that Gary has many hobbies that include playing the ukulele. We need more posts like that, Gary, because they're a lot of fun. And he also is an avid writer of poetry. He carves stone and fish. He does vegetable gardening. He describes all this in Facebook along with his work. So his spouse is a faculty member in nutrition at the University of Georgia, and he has two daughters, also quite distinguished, one a veterinarian, one an MSc student in neurosciences, respectively. So Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me just mention that our event today is being recorded, which means that the chat is going to be recorded. So as you put your comments or questions in chat, that will also get included in the final recording. If you don't want a comment or a remark to be included in the chat, then just private message Spencer Kent, who is our Senior Associate for Membership. And thank you, Spencer, by the way, for all your hard work in organizing the event today. We'll thank you at the end too, but we'll thank you now as well. So just send him a personal message rather than posting in the general chat. So with that, Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce Avi.
Well, thank you, Miriam, and for that wonderful introduction. And I learned long ago in these things that you can make yourself sound really great when you write them yourself.
I
So,
embellished. I put stuff in about your Facebook.
um, so it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Avi Avital. And in the mode of full disclosure, I want to say that my younger daughter is his master's student. So that's how I came to know Avi. But no, I will not release my taxes. Anyway, we've used a lot of time up already, and I think this is going to be a stimulating discussion. I see some faces that I've interacted with on other AEN workshops, both in person and online. All right, well, so Avi completed all three of his degrees at the University of Haifa, which is fairly typical for both European and Middle Eastern students. But he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. He was a visiting scientist at both Stanford at the Institute of Neuroinnovation and also at the U.S. Army Research Lab, which I think is in Bethesda, but Avi can correct me if I'm wrong. He is widely published, and his work has been cited over 2,000 times. He is currently the head of the Behavioral Neuroscience Lab in the Faculty of Medicine at the Technion in Israel, and also Vice Director of Research at the teaching hospital, the Emek Medical Center. Avi's research group currently studies dysregulation in behavioral processes such as social cooperation, attention, and anxiety. And he works with both humans and animal models. In addition, he's unusual as a psychologist because he uses a variety of research techniques, including straight behavioral, pharmacological, and also electrophysiological techniques. During the COVID pandemic, he's been collaborating with other Israeli research institutes as part of an effort to better understand the behavioral consequences of viral infectiousness. And the two areas he's mainly working in, and which he'll talk a little bit about today, I know certainly he'll talk a fair amount about the latter one. The first is he's looking at, with other scientists, the endurance rates of the virus on different surfaces, for example, metal versus wood, et cetera. And also, he is looking at the mental health consequences of treating COVID-19 patients in doctors who do treat COVID-19 patients versus those who do not, and looking at the mental health impact. So we're going to start today with Avi giving us a brief history of how COVID has been handled so far in Israel. And segue a little bit into how the Arab sector versus the Jewish sector is reacting to this. Many of you have been to Israel, but you probably know there are a number of ethnic groups besides just Jews. And of course, there are a number of ethnic groups even within Jews. But there are Bedouins, there's the Bedouin sector, there's the Druze sector, and then there's the general Arab sector. So thank you, Avi, for agreeing to do this. And go ahead, why don't you tell us a bit about how COVID's been handled in Israel?
Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you, Gary, for the lovely introduction. Actually, the COVID, the first outburst was somewhere at the end of January, when a citizen of Israel just came back from Italy, and he was the first positive COVID-19 in Israel. At the beginning, as much as I can judge the policy in Israel, I think that the way that the government coped with the outburst of this COVID in Israel was fantastic at the beginning, because the Ministry of Health was in charge of giving instruction to all parts of the other parts of the government and the population in Israel. So there was one driver to this running train. Along the way, this train adopted more drivers, and then things got more complicated. So at the beginning, the lockdown was easily started by isolating every citizen or every tourist coming from China. That method was correct for the end of January. During February, things and the restriction got more severe, and number of infections was gradually increasing. And then the government decided to just to shut down the main airport to Israel, the Ben Gurion airport, and not to allow any tourists to come into Israel. And of course, there were no departure flights as well. And then again, gradually, when the infections was raising again and again to a higher level, the restriction and the first lockdown actually was built. And I think that, again, that we must put things or the coping with this COVID in context. And the context, unfortunately, is a political context. The atmosphere in Israel is that our prime minister is accused for taking bribes. Things are just under allegations. And many people just went to the street to demonstrate against the prime minister. And now there is a conflict, because on one hand, you need to maintain the regulation and to enforce them. And on the other hand, you have the legitimate right to demonstrate in the name or in the behalf of democracy. So how can you balance between the two without being suspicious that you are using the situation in favor of some kind of quasi-democracy or even small dictatorship? So it's a dilemma, actually. But again, with this very emotional atmosphere, the Ministry of Health in general, they coped quite nicely forming the regulation, and then started a new fight between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Defense. Because according to the Israeli law from 2002, in a case of a national crisis, like a pandemic, the Ministry of Defense should be the one that should lead the policy and to implement the policy, even into a civilian population. The Ministry of Health opposed this, and it's because the fight between two ministers. So that was the new fight. And within this context, I think that less attention was given to the actual regulation, the rationale behind these regulations that actually damage the public trust in the governmental regulation. And with that broken trust, we went out of the first lockdown too fast, unfortunately. And from, let's say, mid-April, which is quite fast, again, from mid-April to end of August, life was coming back to regular conditions. And then second outburst, a huge outburst. if we are talking about few hundreds per day cases of infectious positive COVID per day on the first wave, on the second wave we are talking about thousands, even 9,000 cases per day. It's a huge rate considering the size of the Israeli population. And at the beginning of September, we started the second lockdown. But this time, the citizens of Israel vote from all sectors, the Jewish, Orthodox Jewish, the Arabs, all minorities, everyone will taking the same side, which is the side of broken trust in the government, because there was no consistent rationale of playing the public. The public is not stupid, and it deserves to get explanation why synagogues can be open with 20 persons with some social distancing, and on the other hand, swimming pools with the same condition are forbidden while they are in the open air. So there were too many discrepancies within these new regulations. And there were some voices about opposing the regulation, and it's a chaotic situation when we are considering democracy. Okay, so now we are somewhere at the end of the second wave, and we're starting to get out of the second lockdown. I hope I will as a the first wave.
Could you repeat that?
What, sorry?
We couldn't hear your last sentence.
Yeah, you broke up in the last couple sentences.
You said now we are at the end of the second lockdown.
Yeah, so now we are at the second, almost at the end of the second lockdown, and gradually there is some kind of structured plan how to reopen life in terms of waiting 2 weeks between each step. But I'm not sure that with the broken trust of the public, people will obey to this gradual plan that will take a few months, 3 or even 4 months. And we must remember that now we are starting the winter here in Israel. So we are going to have flu, the seasonal flu. So what about people that are going to get some fever? So what are we going to do with them? To put them in lockdown again, in isolation for 2 weeks? How can we discriminate between those that are positive to COVID and those that are just suffering from seasonal flu? So there are a lot of issues that are not discussed, not planned, and mainly are not transferred in a very transparent way to the public. The Israeli public is not exposed to the decision making of the policymakers. They are just getting these instructions like in a very dark regime. And this is wrong way to do it. You need the cooperation of the public. If you want to get the cooperation of the public, you must. It's not that you should, you must be even with them, be transparent with them. Explain the rationale behind your policy. Otherwise, the vast majority of the people of Israel are clever people, and they will not cooperate with rigid and unexplained instruction.
So I guess I'll talk a little bit about my personal experience, because I was in Israel from March 9th to March 20th. And it was during that period that the real shutdown started. In the beginning of March, restaurants were still open, people were going out, there really wasn't much personal distancing at all. And then there was a clampdown. I know the kibbutz hotel that I was staying in. I was over there working to set up a collaboration with an Israeli wildlife biologist, and of course, that was basically shut down, aside from us being able to interact, because the universities were all closed. All the national touristing sites were closed. And then by about the 15th, I started to get worried about whether I was actually going to be able to fly home, because it was impossible to contact anybody. The airport, the airline. I finally did get through to the American embassy, but it was, although my troubles were fairly minor, it was quite stressful to be over there when things were being shut down in a foreign country and not really speaking the language. Not that anybody was answering the phone anyway. So could you talk a little bit about the differences between the Arab sector's reaction? And you mentioned that now in the second shutdown, there's greater cooperation. Maybe you could talk a little bit about differences between the Jewish sector and Arab sector in terms of attitudes towards healthcare and access to healthcare.
So first of all, I must emphasize that during the first outburst of the COVID, the rate of the infection in the Arab sector was very extremely high. We are talking about 16% of death cases relative to the entire deaths due to the COVID. And the percentage is even higher when we are considering those that were severely infected by the COVID and developed severe symptoms. So I think that the main thing is, the first step in this difference is actually the cultural differences between the Arab section and the Jewish section. And maybe I'm going to surprise you and say that the Arab section is more similar to the Jewish Orthodox sector, because the ceremonies like weddings, they are sacred. You must just conduct them, because it's something that you cannot postpone according to the cultural norms. And it's the same for the Arab sector and the Jewish Orthodox sector. So the weddings is some kind of events that you must invite everyone. You cannot have a small ceremony, wedding ceremony, in the Arab sector with only few dozens of guests. It's hundreds of people that coming to celebrate with the couple, their most significant day. So, and it's a fest. Everyone just eating together without any distancing, of course, and dancing and so on and so forth. So this is a cultural event. And instead, and what was the wrong point? Again, it's a matter of communication. Instead of, gathering the Arab leaders, the mayors of Nazareth and other major cities, and the head of the tribes, the Bedouin tribes, in the Israeli desert, in the Negev, and to give them the respect that they should have to lead their population by sharing the decision making with them and asking them to join the efforts for the sake of their population, prevent those that are going to be severely infected by the COVID. Instead of doing so, they just got instructions without any rationale behind them. So on one hand, they hear on the public TV that the Jewish can go to the sea, can go to synagogues, and they, as Arabs, they are forbidden to have weddings. So they decided not to obey the police. And another, in a parenthesis, I'm going to say something about the context again, that you must realize. The Israeli police is barely visiting the Arab cities. Maybe Nazareth is an exception, but the amount, just for an example, the amount of illegal weapons that is going around in the Arabic cities and villages is huge, and it's a devastating problem. And it's just a symptom of withdrawing the police and the law from these settlements, Arabic settlements. And it's time to use this COVID crisis to embrace the Arab population back to the consensus, to the Israeli consensus. And I think, and this is the most optimistic consequence of this COVID, I think that this movement towards the consensus is really happening during this second lockdown. And I'm giving the credit to the Arabic leaders that show remarkable responsibility towards their citizens, towards their population, and they are explaining them the regulation in the way that the Arabic people can understand, because it's the same cultural language. It's not about the language itself. It's the combination of the language with the adequate psychology or sociology behind it. And again, if the government will have some kind of advising scientific board that will be comprised not only from pandemics experts or microbiologists and so on and so forth, but also with psychologists and sociologists and other academic scientists that will join together in a very integrative way to understand what would be the best way to translate, first of all, to form the regulations, and secondly, to convey these regulations in a way that you will not need to use any enforcement of these regulations. Because if you're going to have cooperation, and I know just a bit about cooperation, about social cooperation, if you will go in this path, you will not, you actually will make the enforcement redundant. So this is the point. And again, the optimistic thing is that during this second wave, the Arabic population is obeying to the regulation. And again, it's not due to the policymakers, it's due to the local leaders that actually translating and emphasizing the importance of these regulations to the public health.
Okay, thank you. Well, I didn't mention in the beginning that we want to leave the last 15 minutes for questions. So we're a little more than 2/3 through. How about if you talk about your research efforts that involve COVID?
Yeah, well, I was a bit puzzled by this COVID era that I hope that will come to its end very soon. As for its effects on academic research, I can see a lot of evidence for those that totally abandoned their research lines in favor of COVID-related so-called research. So I'm not going to judge this movement because I think that it has a very good intention behind it. But I'm a bit worried about the deviation of the scientific deal from the main lines that were ongoing in the last in recent years towards something that is very specific, like the COVID. And actually, in my lab, we collaborated. We didn't initiated a pure COVID-related research in my lab, but rather collaborated with other institutes that on the aspects of animal behaviors. And actually, at the beginning of April, I think, we got the first evidence for the post-infection effects of the COVID. So the rats that were infected with COVID and recovered from it, they maintain some kind of side effects for at least 1 month later in terms of hyperanxiety and impaired attention level. And that was really a troubling effect because it came to my mind that we are dealing with the actual patients of the COVID. But I think that the aftershock is the huge shock of this pandemic. And we are talking about children that during lockdown were exposed to higher level of abuse. We are talking about 30 to 40% increase in antidepressant use, antidepressant drugs. People are losing their jobs, so their economical status is going down. So there are a lot of adverse effects for this COVID, and unfortunately, I'm not relying on the policymakers to pay attention to these near future and own consequences of the COVID. A specific paper that we going to send out and to submit very soon is regarding the effect of the COVID, not on the patient, but rather on the forefront fighters with the COVID, the real soldiers and officers in fighting the COVID, which are mainly the internal medicine doctors in the COVID departments. And we examined them with some physiological and also subjective reports, and we found that they are reporting, though they are reporting increase in social support because there was the applause effect all over the world. They are also showing very bothering high level of anxiety with high level of hypervigilance. And this pattern is similar to those veterans coming back from wars like Vietnam and other battlefields. So we are talking about the emergence of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder, in these doctors. And we compared it to other medical doctors that are coping with very intensive and very significant workload in other departments, non-COVID departments. So we are going to send out this paper, and hopefully, the editor will not be um, or we hope that he will be bold enough to embrace this paper and to publish it, because I think that it has a message that we should thank and preserve the heroes of this COVID fight, of this battle, and I'm talking about these doctors, and we must think about ways to preserve them, because we need them in the post-COVID era, also to treat us. So that was about a little bit about science.
All right, and we have a few minutes left for the general discussion. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
No, I think that I covered everything. I think also the most important thing is that we should aim and think about the day after the COVID in all aspects of life. And I think that mainly we should put aside politics and politicians, and like in a real war, we need the professionals to handle it. And I see too little involvement of scientists. You know, governments are investing a lot of money in the scientific community, in the scientific infrastructure worldwide. And this is the right time. It's time to get the payroll, to get back the investment from the scientific community. And it's time to build the decision upon evidence-based, and not with some mixed political interests. And this is unfortunately something that we can see in a worldwide, except some pure example like in New Zealand, in which there is a very strong, I'm happy to say, woman leader that decide how to, together with the scientific community in New Zealand, decided which program is the best. She conveyed the program to the public, explained every corner and every detail in her program, and she got full cooperation from the public. No police barrier, no army forces on the street, nothing. Just explaining the public the rationale that is evidence-based, clear and clean from any political interest. And this is the secret. And I think that in Israel, that will bring together better the Arabic sector with the Jewish sector. Something that we can see right now, and I hope that it will continue, because it's one of the beautiful effects in a very, I would say, dark time in terms of public health.
All right, thank you. Well, I want to reiterate, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. And the first question that I received was from Dr. Reinhartz, who asked if you had any information about decision making in kibbutzim with respect to COVID.
Yeah, well, my sister is a kibbutznikit. She lives in a kibbutz in Mishmar HaEmek. It's in the Israeli Valley. And they just closed the gate, and they control everyone that comes in or getting out of the kibbutz. It's a closed community, and it's like a capsule, a human capsule that just tightened their guard around the kibbutz. So they are maintaining almost all activities. They are isolating people. If someone just came back from abroad, so automatically the kibbutz is sending a car. They have a very strict regulation as for the way that they are treating those that were infected with COVID or suspected to be infected with the COVID. And I think that it's a model. The kibbutz is a model that should be extrapolated to the entire population.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, I just got one from Professor Gilbert. And he asks, what has been the effect of COVID on political affairs? Specifically, how has it affected support for the Prime Minister? How has it affected the unity government with Benny Gantz? That's like 5 questions. Let's start with the first one, which was the general effects of COVID on political affairs and the unity government.
Well, I think that it has some conflicting effects. I cannot, give weight to each side, but I suspect that the main effect is against the prime minister because of the economical devastating effects of the lockdown. People that traditionally were in favor of Mr. Netanyahu, our prime minister, they reconsider their political views. So they are not out on the streets demonstrating against him, but on the other hand, they are not opposing those thousands of people every evening up in the highway bridges and in the center of cities of Israel, many cities. And on the rural ways, people are just standing with the flag of Israel and a black flag, and with some demo submarines, because one of the claims is that he got benefits from some kind of submarine purchase from Germany, from ThyssenKrupp or something like that. And every evening people are getting out and demonstrating, even if the restriction is just staying not more than 1 kilometer from your house. So people are getting to the main road that is less than 1 kilometer from their houses and demonstrating. And those that are traditionally in favor of our prime minister, they are just staying back home, trying to cope with this economical catastrophe, because the government, we have the money, but again, the trajectory or the mechanism to convey the money, to give it to the people of Israel is lacking any rationale, any effectiveness. It's really sad, actually, because people are getting more and more poor.
Okay, we do have a few more questions, and just to cut down on feedback and cats jumping off bookcases, I'm gonna ask the questions. If I don't convey your question appropriately, just text me in the chat and I'll try and do a better job. So Professor Serpa has a question. Opposing point of views are inherent to public health problem solving, especially when there is a situation of a natural health crisis. How in Israel are people navigating information sharing and rapid action response?
Well, people are using more the social media in order to get information. But watching the different TV channels in Israel, you can see that there is a confusion as for the information that is conveyed to the public, and the social media is full with fake news. It's amazing, this phenomenon of fake news just um, led to some uh, huge amount of inconfidence of the sources of information. So people cannot rely on the validity and availability of the information that they are getting from the news, from the newspapers, and so on and so forth. And they went back to the Facebook and Twitter and Instagram to get information from one each other. And there are a lot of disinformation over there. So this is one point. The second point that we must bear in mind, going back to the minorities in Israel, talking, for example, about the Bedouins. Most of the Bedouins, they don't have access to internet. And it's a problem in terms of, first of all, in terms of getting information, whether it's good information or just false information or fake information. Secondly, while the education system in Israel is shut down, the way that people or pupils can still get education is through Zoom meetings with their teacher. And what happens if you have 3 kids or 5 kids or 10 kids in terms of almost the usual Bedouin family? How can you manage without internet? And if you already have, for some reason, internet, how can you manage 10 kids that should be on a Zoom lesson in parallel? So the government is not paying any attention to these aspects.
Okay, so Professor Haas has a question, and Professor Gilbert, I'll get back to your other questions. I just want everyone to have a chance to ask at least one question. So Professor Haas asks, early in the epidemic, the government put together a task force to model the epidemic using machine learning led by a group including Professor Shasua at Hebrew U. Professor Haas's, he says, limited understanding, probably not true, is that they recommended something like the Swedish approach. And do you know about this this project and what its recommendations have been?
Yeah, so there were several significant projects. One is coming from the Hebrew University, and the other one is coming from the Weizmann Institute. And they gave totally different recommendations. So probably once the recommendations were too separated, and they recommended something totally different, the government just throw them both out of the window. So at the beginning, the Swedish model was something that was considered, and recently it came up again. We called it the herd infection. And there is an argument as for what is the rate to achieve it, whether it's 60% infection rate or less or even more. I think that the best model for this idea is the Jewish Orthodox community, because they are already approximately at the rate of 30% of the Jewish Orthodox that actually lives in a close community, most of it, they are already infected. So that will be a model. The other option came from the Weizmann Institute that is not in favor of this Swedish model. And they are talking about using machine learning in order to, and some mathematical algorithms in order to decode the infectious chain in order to limit the infection rate. So this is some kind of an opposite approach.
I'd just like to say from a scientific point of view that, of course, the Trump administration appears to be passively adopting the herd immunity model, but COVID is it seems to be unlike almost any other disease. It presents with many different symptoms in different people. And we already know that people can catch the disease more than once. So the whole herd immunity model is based on the idea that you get it once and then you get immunity. And this is clearly not the case with this disease. So there's another question from Professor Kopstein that touches on something you've said, and he asks, you mentioned increased compliance from the Arab communities with public health recommendations. You didn't mention this for the Haredi community. Is there increased compliance, or is there political fallout since the Haredi are in the coalition government?
The Haredi, you mean the Jewish Orthodox, right?
Right.
Okay.
Did I mispronounce it?
No, you pronounce it very well. I think that the ball is now upside down. So in a very amazing way, I think that the compliance in the Arabic sector is better than in the Haredi, in the Jewish Orthodox sector. And it has nothing to do with the fact that the representative of this Jewish Orthodox, they are serving as ministers in the government. It has nothing to do with it. They are playing double game. To the public face, they are saying, yeah, we should keep our population safe and stay away from the synagogue. And on the other hand, they are encouraging them to go to the synagogue. You know, there was an amazing video clip in which you can see an Yiddish-speaking Haredi that was asked by a policeman to take a mic and to tell everyone to go out of the synagogue and go back home and stay safe. And to say it in Yiddish, because in this Bnei Brak, they mainly speak Yiddish. And translating his Yiddish, you can understand that he said to everyone on the street, please go back home for 10 minutes until the policeman will be away, and then you can go back to the synagogue using the mic of the police car. It's amazing. And the rabbis, the huge rabbis, the most significant rabbis of the Jewish Orthodox, they strictly said, listen, disobey to the government. Go to the synagogue. It's the Jewish holidays now. We just finished it with Sukkot, and we had the Rosh Hashanah, the New Year Eve, and the Yom Kippur, which is a very sacred day, and people just disobeyed because they decided that it was taking the risk of getting infected and maybe dying and some of them really died. But to go to the synagogue and pray to God. And again, I think that if the government would have supplied a very sensitive, a culture sensitive tool to this population, and the same for the Arabic population, then we could have found the middle line between the population need to do their traditional and religious ceremonies and public health. It's a matter of balancing between these motivations.
Okay, well, we have time just for one quick question here, and this is from Professor Serpa again, who asks, how can academics get buy-in from policymakers to address COVID-19 PTSD?
Again, I'm not sure that I got the question.
So the question is, how can academics get buy-in? It's an American phrase meaning get credibility, have an influence on policymakers, and get them to address the PTSD in physicians caused by the disease, or anyone else, actually.
I think that the way that the academic persons should do it, the scientists should do it, is just using very cleverly the media to go out, not to the streets, to go to the TV studios, to go to the internet, and to be more involved, to plan some kind of comprehensive plan with some specific tasks, and to just to go to this battlefield. Because if we will leave as scientists, if we will leave this battlefield to politicians and to those that are not scientists, we are going to cut the tree that we are sitting on. Because at some point, the public will claim and say that, we are investing a lot of the public money in research. Now it's pay time. Where the solution that the scientific community should have brought to us during this COVID? Nothing. We need to be compensated. Otherwise, we will cut budget. And this is the wrong, and this is the most devastating effect that we might cope with as part of this aftershock, after COVID era. And we must, as scientists, build a plan. And like any war, we need to have a few brigades that going to the studios, comprised of microbiologists, epidemiologists, sociologists, psychologists. Any scientific field has its role in this war, and we must do it in a very rapid way, very consistent way, and mainly worldwide, because we have the power. The scientific world is the most organized community in the world.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of our webinar here, and I just want to thank Avi so much for the really informative webinar. I'm going to send Avi's contact information to Spencer, who hopefully can send it to anyone who is interested. I have had several chat posts here that people are interested in talking with you. And we'll stay in touch. I know Miriam wants to say a few words, and thanks so much again for your enlightening talk. And thanks to the audience. You all were a great audience too. Those were some really good questions.
Let me just
Thank you.
Second, Gary, and thank you so much, Avi, for joining us and for sharing your insights, and for all your hard work and everything you're doing to advance our understanding of this this terrible disease and what it's likely to do on the day after. And we're only now hearing more and more of that. You know, people who recover, it's not a full recovery. So thank you for all your efforts, and thank you to everybody for joining. We will have all throughout the year other webinars and ways to engage on COVID. We have an upcoming webinar that you can join that we're preparing and in the planning stages now to talk about COVID and its impact on the American university and higher education, and also our own issues. And we'll have plenty of other webinars. There are book talks in the work. There's an e-conference in the works, and more to come. Of course, if you have any further ideas for Gary about the AEN section in STEM, for faculty in STEM, you can please get a hold of Gary or reach out to Spencer. And let me just take this time now to, in addition to thanking Gary and Avi, to thank Spencer, our Senior Associate for Membership, for all his efforts in getting us together today and helping to organize the logistics of the webinar. So thank you very much, Spencer, as well. So have a rest of a good day and enjoy and stay healthy and safe.